Welcome back. Well, now the U.S. national debt is creeping ever so closer to $37 trillion. Interest payments alone on the debt, one of the biggest line items in the federal budget. Some economists are warning this could create a fiscal crisis. Joining me right now is a woman who knows better than anybody. Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget President Maya MacGuineas is here. Maya, great to see you.
Nice to be with you.
Thank you so much for being here. I want to get right to the elephant in the room, and that is Congress is working on this reconciliation package. They want to extend President Trump's tax cuts, and you say?
Well, we're going to have to offset that with some spending cuts. So there's a whole lot of conversation about tax cuts. And those in many ways need to happen in the fact that if you were to let these expire, it would be a huge tax increase and have a negative effect in the immediate run. However, fiscally, it would help. And so instead of just cutting taxes, we have to cut spending. And Maria, nobody is talking about that. Right? So we're talking about bills that no matter what, and there's two different approaches, one in the House, one in the Senate. The House is far superior, I have to say. But both of them are talking about cutting a range of only a couple $1 trillion in the House and only $4 billion in the Senate. This is out of a total of $86 trillion in spending over the same time period. So for a party that's been talking about cutting spending a lot, yes, I understand we're going to cut taxes. That will help with growth. That will help keep the tax rates where they are. But if we don't cut spending, this will balloon the national debt. And the debt is a big topic here. People in the markets are definitely aware of this problem.
Absolutely. Well, look, to be fair, most Republicans that I've spoken with always say the same thing, and that is we have a spending problem. We don't have, another problem. It's a spending problem. Now, you've got an op-ed. You talk about this in your op-ed. You say the financial situation is, quote, dire. And I want to get your take on where the cuts could come from, because you're right. This weekend on Sunday Morning Futures, I had on John Barrasso, leadership in the Senate, and I said to him, how is it possible that the Senate has only identified $4 billion in cuts when the House is at $1.5 trillion? And he said he's going to come up with at least $2 trillion in cuts. Where specifically should Congress be cutting?
Well, good. First off, let's hold them to that $2 trillion, because even then we're going to be borrowing another $3, $4, $5 trillion, given all of the tax cuts. But and like you said, the problem is spending. If you look forward, the growth in the budget comes from spending, not revenues that are lower than they traditionally have been as a share of the economy, but spending. But you have to have the willpower to cut the spending. So the problem is they're taking everything off the table. So one thing is that in reconciliation, the biggest program and the biggest challenge, quite frankly, Social Security cannot be included. We can go back and talk about Social Security, but that program, despite what every politician is telling us, is headed towards insolvency. And if we don't make changes to strengthen it, there will be across-the-board automatic spending cuts, which is a terrible, terrible thing that's even in the future. There are things that they can be looking at. They should be looking at Medicare, and they should and are be looking at Medicaid, because our health care delivery system has tons of areas where there are huge problems. We've expanded the budget at health care massively in recent times, and we have not brought that back to different levels. There are a lot of savings there that will not affect recipients. But I'm also worried about the conversation of, we shouldn't affect everybody. We've borrowed trillions too much every single year. We're going to have to make some real choices. Yeah. But another area in the budget they're not looking at all, $20 trillion plus in tax expenditures over the budget window. And that is, quite frankly, spending through the tax code. So we act like it's tax cuts, but it's things that really increase in inefficiencies, equities, de-level the playing field. We want to broaden that tax base so we can keep rates low and then look at all the areas of the budget, the discretionary portion, welfare programs, Medicaid, which they're looking at, but there's spectrum, there's repealing parts of the IRA, the ACA, a lot of things that have expanded in the past couple of years that we could scale back, and we could certainly get that $2 trillion, and frankly, we should be shooting for more.
Well, I'm with you on the Inflation Reduction Act. There's so much fat in that IRA, for sure. But herein lies the debate within the Republican Congress, the House and the Senate, and they can only afford 3 votes, no votes, in order to pass President Trump's agenda. Many people are saying this is our once-in-a-generation opportunity to actually seriously put a dent in spending. You just mentioned Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. DOJ came up with these ideas and said, look, there's waste, fraud, and abuse, but that's a drop in the bucket, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, I'm a fan of Doge. I think we should be Doging everything and look through the line item of everything, getting into the details. Really impressive. But it also became the bright, shiny object that took the oxygen away from where the real structural savings are. So we've got to get rid of waste and frost. We have to improve efficiencies. I think Doge can restructure some of our agencies in ways that would work better, but that is not going to save the trillions that we need to save. We have to look at our mandatory spending. We have to do defense spending smarter. We're going to need more revenues in defense. The truth is, as the world gets riskier, but we have to look at our procurement process and other areas, and we have to look at every one of our major programs, many of which just have not been discussed for specific spending cuts in years, and people are used to pretending we don't have to make any choices.
Well,
that's what budgets are, though. They're
once
choices.
you give somebody something, they don't want to give it back.
You have a constituency for it.
And by the way, what elected official do you know that's actually going to come out and say, yeah, I'm running for re-election in November, but by the way, I'm cutting your Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security while I do it?
But everybody talks about cutting spending in the talking points. Nobody's willing to fill in the details. And now that we have to talk about details, that's where it's getting more difficult. Credit to those fiscal conservatives, particularly in the House, who are actually pushing to do more spending cuts. The real divide is between those folks who say, I'm not going to touch Medicaid. We need to touch Medicaid. There are savings to be had there, more so even with Medicare. Credit for the ones who are actually willing to have the conviction, the courage of their conviction, and talk about enacting some of those cuts now that they have the opportunity.
When you say we are going to have to cut Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, what are you saying? Are you saying you want to cut those programs back to give people less?
First off, let me just say, I don't want to do this. I wish we hadn't been borrowing for 3 decades. Right. So now what we're going to have to do is a little bit of everything. There are ways to start by improving the efficiencies of every one of those programs.
Yeah, good.
And then you have so much built-in growth. What we just need to do is grow the programs more slowly.
I know you're talking about this. Go ahead, finish.
No, I was just going to say that it doesn't mean we'll actually be spending less. We're going to be spending more each year than the year before. Even under the budgets they're talking about, reconciliation, we'll be spending many more trillions over the budget window, not less. We're not cutting, but we do need to bring the growth rate down from where it is.
See, the last time Congress was at this in President Trump's first term, they did the tax cuts in December. But now they've got the debt ceiling, and President Trump wants that raised by $5 trillion.
Yeah.
So they've got this X date. They've got to do it sooner. Now, let me ask you about the president's budget, because he's proposing $163 billion in cuts from the federal budget. He's targeting federal programs like climate initiatives, public broadcasting, foreign aid. Your assessment?
Well, it's interesting. So on the micro level, there are very large cuts in certain areas, like you just mentioned. On the macro level, that $163 billion that would be reduced in the discretionary budget, they're actually adding back in the reconciliation bill. So again, not really all the spending cuts we're talking about. So in specific areas, there would be very large cuts, much larger than we've generally seen. But at the top macro level, we're actually talking about budget that would be flat. All of it would be added back in, but much of it would be taken away from domestic discretionary and moved into the areas of defense and homeland security.
What specifically, go back to the cuts here for a second on Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid that you want to say. What specifically, what number and how much do you think they could cut without really cutting into the muscle of what people are expecting, our seniors?
Yeah, let me first say where I think the target should be, because I think Secretary Bessent has laid out the exact rate target.
Well, he knows
the correct target. He knows this issue. He cares about this issue. And he said we need to get our budget deficits down from where they are above 6% of GDP to 3% of GDP. Let's go. Let's make that our target. That is a very aggressive number. But keep in mind, we used to talk about balancing the budget. This is only half that, right? So this is getting it to a sustained deficit, whereas we used to be shooting for zero. That would take about $7.5 trillion in savings over a budget window, and that is about 5 times as much as the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is the previous and only debt reduction deal that we've had in over a decade. So it's very significant. It is doable, but it's certainly aggressive enough that it would reassure markets. You need to look at everything, though. On Social Security, I'll say the hard things other people won't. We need to talk about raising the retirement age and slowing the growth of benefits for people at the higher end. We need to talk about our delivery system in Medicare. We need to talk about all sorts of things like how we charge different amounts of money for the same health care at different areas and create something called site neutral. On Medicaid, we have all these provider taxes that are really state gimmicks, scams, honestly. We need to clear them out of there and do those things first. $7.5 trillion in savings is a lot, but the 3% target is what we should be shooting for.
By the way, I don't know why everybody's afraid of raising the retirement age.
know.
We're working, we're
living.
living longer, and we're working longer anyway.
And let me be
Nobody
clear.
actually, you know, retires and then goes and jumps on the hammock.
Well, and
right? I mean, they're doing other stuff.
And it's
so,
it's
yeah,
not for
there
the
you go.
bricklayer. It's not for somebody who's been doing backbreaking work, but people who are sitting at their desks or
Right.
working to 70, 80, we're living decades longer.
That's
You
an
can't
easy
afford
one.
not to do
In
this.
my view, and I
Right?
hope I'm not insulting anybody at home because I love our viewers so much, but I don't think that's a tough one. Maya, great to have you.
Thanks,
We got to
Sarah.
wrap this
Thanks for
up.
having
We
me.
so appreciate your work. Very important work. Maya MacGuineas, we'll be right back.